The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said to his disciples, "A rich man had a steward who was reported to him for squandering his property. He summoned him and said, 'What is this I hear about you? Prepare a full account of your stewardship, because you can no longer be my steward.' The steward said to himself, 'What shall I do, now that my master is taking the position of steward away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that, when I am removed from the stewardship, they may welcome me into their homes.' He called his master's debtors one by one. To the first he said, 'How much do you owe my master?' He replied, 100 measures of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Here is your promissory note. Sit down and quickly write one for 50. Then to another the steward said, 'And you, how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 cores of wheat. The steward said to him, 'Here is your promissory note. Write one for 80. And the master commended that dishonest steward for acting prudently. For the children of this world are more prudent in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. I tell you, make friends for yourselves with dishonest wealth, so that when it fails, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. The person who is trustworthy in very small matters is also trustworthy in great ones. And the person who is dishonest in very small matters is also dishonest in great ones. If, therefore, you are not trustworthy with dishonest wealth, who will trust you with true wealth? If you are not trustworthy with what belongs to another, who will give you what is yours? No servant can serve two masters. He will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Some of you may know that I have two brothers. One of them is 2 years younger than myself, and when I was a junior, he decided that it would be a good idea for him to also come to the University of Dallas. Now, I double majored in philosophy and in theology. Michael, my younger brother by 2 years, double majored in philosophy and in politics. So, like you might imagine, just like UD students, just like brothers are inclined to do, we had a number of very interesting conversations. And a sort of stereotype that we would tease each other about is because I studied theology, I was kind of looking upward, maybe having my head in the clouds a bit too much. And my brother, because he was majoring in politics, his gaze was more towards the earth, right? More towards the compromise to get things done, real politic. One of the most interesting conversations that Michael and I had revolved around one of the verses from the Gospel that we just heard from Luke. For the children of this world are more prudent in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. This pericope, this set of parables and then words by Jesus is fascinating because it's so perplexing. It's so confusing. Now, I really hope as you heard the gospel being proclaimed, your reaction was like, what? What is going on here? It is not clear either in the parable or in Jesus' own words the lesson that we are supposed to take. It is strange. It is perplexing. It is not clear, even on the merits of the parable itself, what is going on. Think of it this way. Who is the good guy? It's not clear from the parable, because the first person that we hear about is a rich man. Is the rich man the good guy? Well, think back to the past few weeks what we've heard about Luke and what Jesus says about riches and poverty. Over and over again, Jesus warns about being rich, about storing up for ourselves earthly treasure. So, if Luke's pattern is to be followed, the good guy is not the rich man. Could it be the steward? Well, also in that same first verse, the steward is dishonest. He is reported to his master for wasting his property. And then at the end of the parable, it's also confusing. Why is the steward praised? The master commended that dishonest steward for acting prudently. Was it a matter of prudence that the steward wrote off the debt owed to his master? He, by the rules of the parable, this is not what a good steward does. According to the rules of this parable, a good steward would have collected all of the debts that were owed to his master. So for the master to commend his steward for acting in such a way seems to be strange. Now, what usually follows a parable is an explanation of Jesus about the parable to sort of clarify, this is what I mean when I'm giving you this image. Well, it's almost like, peace to some professors, it's almost like when a professor gives a lecture, you ask them, I'm sorry, could you explain that? And their explanation almost makes the thing worse. Jesus' words seem to obscure this already obscure parable. I tell you, make friends for yourselves with virtuous people, with holy people, with people who follow the law. No. Make friends for yourselves with dishonest wealth, so that when it fails, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. What is going on here? What is the meaning of this seemingly incomprehensible parable and words of our Lord? One possible interpretation to understand this passage from Luke is to see that there are two stories that are taking place here. The first story we sort of take for granted. We may not even think of it as a story. That first story is the story of Luke's Gospel. The story of the birth, the ministry, the miracles, the teaching, the passion, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus. This story follows a pattern. The story of Jesus has its own rules. The second story exists within the first. This second story takes place within the story of Jesus. This second story, if you will, is the world of the parables. And the parables have their own rules. Normally, these two stories, the story of Jesus going through the Gospels and the story of the drama of the parables, are like two independent opposing lanes of traffic. They run parallel to each other. But just like on a highway, sometimes there is crossover between these two lanes. Now, if I was like that professor that I just referred to previously and I confused you more, if this is more obscure, I will make a nerd reference to prove my own street nerd cred. In Star Trek. It's a good show. It shows. In Star Trek, there is the normal, regular universe with our normal cast of characters. You have Captain Kirk, you have Spock, you have Captain Sisko, Worf, and so on and so forth. And these characters behave in expected ways, right? If you're familiar with Captain Kirk, he's the proverbial good guy. He's a bit foolish, a bit violent, a bit headstrong, but he is fundamentally good. He is the protagonist. His right hand, his first officer, Mr. Spock, is logical. He might seem to be a little cold at times, but he has a deep sense of love and devotion to his captain and to his crew. That normal universe follows a certain pattern of rules. Now, running alongside this normal universe is what's called the mirror universe. Now, if you know Star Trek, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, but I figure most of you probably don't. The mirror universe has the same characters as the normal universe, but in the mirror universe, characters behave in very different ways. For instance, the mirror universe Kirk is not good, but he is sadistic, bloodthirsty, and evil. and Spock is also morally ambiguous. This parallel universe has its own rules. It has its own pattern. Normally, these two universes are separate. They're independent of each other. But sometimes there is crossover between these two. Characters from the normal universe sometimes enter the parallel universe, and the parallel universe characters sometimes enter the normal one. This is how it was first introduced in the 1960s, and that was sort of the cause in the episode of both humor and drama, was it took the characters a while to figure out that the Kirks switched places so that the bad Kirk came to the normal universe and the good Kirk went to the mirror universe. Let's jump back to the gospel. The master commanded that dishonest steward for acting prudently. Who is the master? In Greek, the word that's used is ho kurios. Who is he? Who is the one who is praising this dishonest steward? Is it the rich man? This seems strange, after all, because the rich man would not be very happy when his steward wrote off most of the debts that were owed to him. So it would seem to be strange that the master is the same master that we heard at the beginning of the parable, because it goes against the rules of the world of the parable. A good steward would have been praised for collecting all of the money owed to his master. So, then is the master Jesus? Again, this seems strange, that Jesus would praise the steward for collecting temporal security. Or maybe to put it another way, it seems strange given what Jesus has said these past few weeks, that now all of a sudden Jesus is praising someone who stores up for himself not treasure in heaven, but treasure on earth. This doesn't seem to make sense, because it doesn't follow the rules of the drama of the gospel, the narrative that Luke sets out of Jesus' life. These narratives, these stories, universes, if you want to think of it like that, are meant to cross over into each other. The story of the parables intersects with the story of Jesus in Luke's gospel and vice versa. And in addition to that, our story, our lives are meant to intersect with the world of the parables and the world of Jesus in the gospel. This isn't just something interesting to learn about. This is relevant to our lives. As Catholics, we have the blessing of experiencing this crossover between worlds sacramentally at each and every Mass. The central character in the drama of Jesus' life, the person who creates the world of the parables, becomes truly and substantially present here at the altar, at every single Mass. This is the purpose of hearing the parables. This is the purpose of hearing the drama of the Gospels over and over throughout the liturgical year, is to allow our world to collide with Jesus's and the world of the parables. So, who is the Master? In verse 8. The ambiguity of whether the Master is the rich man in the parable or Jesus is meant to challenge us to answer the question, which master will you serve? Because according to the rules of the world of the parable, a good steward carefully collects all of the money, diligently collects all that is owed to his master. But in the story of the world of Jesus, the sort of master that Jesus is, he forgives debts. And a good steward imitates his master and forgives all of the debts owed. The answer to the question, who is the master, is meant to be answered in our own lives when we decide who we will serve. When I took Synoptic Gospels from Dr. Mark Goodwin, one of the things that he taught us about parables is that parables, good ones, resist an easy resolution and resist a simple explanation. Because, after all, they are trying to illustrate what cannot be illustrated. They're trying to explain the unexplainable. the kingdom of God. And in this way, the parable of the dishonest steward is a most excellent parable, because it challenges our beliefs about who we should serve and how we should serve. As we prepare to receive the body of Christ and come forward to receive the person of Christ into our own bodies, may we also receive him into our own story, into our lives.